Okay, welcome back. The next one we're going to move on to is the dividends. And in this dividends, or this particular question, there were just dividends paid. There was no proposed dividends. So it's going to be slightly different if there was interim dividends and proposed dividends. So I'll show you, I think that happened in the 2006 question. So I'll show you that shortly. But first of all, where they just give you a figure of dividends paid. If we have a look over here at the question, where are we? Dividends paid. It might be difficult to see, but the dividends paid there is 43,000. Okay, and so when we are explaining in our note about the dividends, we must show how much of the dividends, first of all, of that 43,000 were for ordinary shareholders or ordinary dividends, and how much was for preference dividends. And then furthermore, we must then break it down into what that works out per individual ordinary and preference share. So first of all, to take the 43,000 and divide it up and figure out this 35 and this 8, well, excuse me, if there was no interim and no proposed, then you just take this 43,000 that you start with. I'm just going to write it down here. 43,000, that's the dividends you paid in total. We know that any preference shareholders must get paid their dividend before you're allowed to give any dividends to the ordinary shareholders. So theirs is kind of like almost like a loan that they've given that you must pay interest on. You've no choice. Whereas the ordinary shareholders, they bought their shares, and sometimes they may get a dividend, sometimes they may not get any dividend. Sometimes what they get may be much more than what the preference shareholders get. Sometimes it may be much less. Okay, so it can vary. The directors decide about the ordinary dividends, but they have no choice in the preference dividends. So for the preference dividends, if they're 8% preference shares, 100,000, it means that they must receive 8% of that 100,000. So if we work out what 8% of 100,000 is, which is 8,000, isn't it? But I'll just do it for the sake of it. 8,000. If they have to receive that, no more, no less, then out of that 43,000, the preference shareholders must have received 8,000. So if then we subtract that 8,000 from the total amount of dividends you paid, you'll be left with this figure of 35,000, which must be what the ordinary shareholders received. Okay, so back here to the question. That's where you get this. 43,000 was the total. Focus in there a bit. Your ordinary shareholders got 35,000 in ordinary dividends. Your preference shareholders got 8,000 in their preference dividends, and they won't get any more or less. Now we must just divide up, work out what this 35,000 in total that you gave to all the shareholders works out per share, and what this 8,000 works out per share. Now I'll show you how to work it out, but there's a kind of a shortcut for the preference shareholders. If the preference rate is 8%, then this will work out at 8 cents. If it had been 10%, then this would be 10 cents. But I'll show you the other way to work it out as well. Is you just take the, I'll get my calculator here, just to make sure there are no mistakes in this question. If we get the 8,000 that was paid out to preference shareholders, and we know that there were 100,000 €1 preference shares. If we look here, 8% preference shares, €1 each. So if you have 100,000 euros worth of them, then there must be 100,000 of them. So if you get this 8,000 that you paid out and you divide it by the 100,000 shares, preference shares that have been issued, then that'll give you your 8 cents per share. Okay, 0.08, and that's 8 cents, isn't it? Okay, then you can do the same thing then for the ordinary shareholders, and we know there's 35 you paid out in total to all of them. So if we take that 35,000, 35,000, and we divide it by, again, we look at where's our ordinary shares. Oh yeah, ordinary shares, 350,000. And remember, it's up here, just so that we're clear on this, you've got 500,000 ordinary shares that you can issue. Okay, but what you have issued is 350,000 of them so far. So you're dividing that 35,000 amongst 350,000 shares. And again, if I work that out, it's going to be 0.10, so it's going to be 10 cents per share. Okay, and that's what we have up here as well, 10 cents per share.